September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Isle of Mull, Scotland. The fishing boats of Tobermory Harbour rock gently in the morning mist, their masts silhouetted against a sky that holds no hint of the darkness about to engulf the world. In London, 500 miles to the south, Neville Chamberlain sleeps fitfully, knowing that within hours he will face the most momentous decision of his political career. But here, in this small Scottish town of barely 1,000 souls, something extraordinary is about to happen, something that will make history, yet remain buried in government archives for over half a century, something so bold, so unprecedented, that it will technically make Scotland the first part of the British Empire to declare war on Nazi Germany. For 45 a.m., precisely 515 miles away in the darkness of Poland, German tanks have already crossed the border. The Wehrmacht's Operation Fallweiscase White has begun. The world is at war. Though most of it doesn't know it yet, radio broadcasts won't reach Britain for hours. Newspapers won't print the headlines until evening. But in Tobermory, one man is already wide awake, staring out at the harbor where his grandfather once told him stories of Scottish warriors who never surrendered. Provost Donald MacLeod stands at his cottage window, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. At 54, he carries himself with the dignity of a man whose ancestors fought beside William Wallace, whose family survived the Highland clearances, and whose very blood carries the memory of resistance against impossible odds. He doesn't know it yet, but within 12 hours, he will make a decision that will send shockwaves through the corridors of power in London, Edinburgh, and Berlin. This is not a story you'll find in most history books. This is not a tale that Westminster wanted preserved. This is the story of how a single Scottish council meeting changed the course of World War II 2 full days before Britain itself found the courage to act. It is the story of how ordinary people in an extraordinary time chose to lead when their leaders hesitated, chose to act when their government labored, and chose to stand when the world trembled. Who was this man who dared to declare war on the Third Reich? What drove him to take such an audacious step? What happened in that council chamber that September afternoon that would make Hitler himself take notice of a Scottish fishing village? And why has this incredible tale been buried in classified files for over 80 years? The answers will challenge everything you thought you knew about how World War II began. They will reveal the untold story of courage in the face of evil, of leadership in the absence of leaders, of a moment when the fate of democracy hung in the balance and was saved not by armies or governments, but by the moral courage of ordinary people who refused to wait for permission to do what was right. This is the story of Scotland's secret war declaration, a story of defiance that echoed through the halls of power, a story of a small town that stood up to the greatest evil the world had ever known, a story of how for 48 hours Scotland led the British Empire into war. But before we can understand what happened in Tobermory on September 1st, 1939, we must first understand the Scotland that shaped the man who would defy an empire to save the world. The Isle of Mull sits like a jewel in the Inner Hebrides, its rugged coastline battered by centuries of Atlantic storms. To reach Tobermory, you must first cross the Sound of Mull, a stretch of water that has claimed countless ships, and witness the rise and fall of clans, the coming and going of kings, and the birth and death of nations. But Tobermory itself is different from the wild highlands that surround it, with its row of colorful houses facing the harbor. Red, yellow, blue, and green, it looks almost Mediterranean in the Scottish summer. The town curves around a natural harbor so perfect that it seems designed by Providence itself. Here, fishing boats have sheltered for 1,000 years. Here, merchants have traded, travelers have rested, and stories have been told that echo through generations. In 1939, Tobermory was home to 987 people. They knew each other's names, each other's stories, and each other's sorrows and joys. There was Hamish Macpherson, who ran the bakery and had lost his eldest son in the Great War. There was Margaret Campbell, the postmistress, whose husband had died at Passchendaele. There was young Jeanie Stewart, barely 18, who dreamed of joining the Highland Regiment like his father before him. But these were not simple fishing folk living in isolation. The people of Tobermory read newspapers, listened to Thewlis, and watched the newsreels when they traveled to the mainland. They had seen the footage from Germany, the torchlit parades, the book burnings, and the broken glass of Kristallnacht. They had heard the speeches, seen the maps, and understood what was coming, and they had a leader unlike any other in the British Empire. Provost Donald MacLeod was not just the ceremonial head of their town council. He was a man who embodied the very spirit of Scotland itself, proud, stubborn, fiercely independent, and absolutely unwilling to bow to any authority he didn't respect. Born in 1885 in a cottage that still stands on the hill above WWII Harbour, Donald MacLeod was the son of a fisherman and the grandson of a Highland warrior. His great-grandfather had fought at Culloden in 1746, surviving the slaughter to return home with stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. His grandfather had been driven from his land during the Highland clearances, forced to watch as English landlords burned his home to make room for sheep. The MacLeod family had never forgotten these lessons. They had learned that justice delayed is justice denied, that courage unused is courage wasted, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the dangerous thing to do. Donald's father had taught him that a man's worth is not measured by his possessions or his position, but by his willingness to stand up for what he believes, regardless of the consequences. Donald MacLeod was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had left school at 14 to work the fishing boats, had learned to read by candlelight, and had studied history and politics and philosophy in the margins of a working man's life. But he possessed something that all the university degrees in the world cannot provide: moral clarity. He could see right from wrong with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from a life lived close to the elements, close to danger, and close to the fundamental truths of human existence. By 1939, he had been provost of Tobermory for 7 years. He had guided the town through the worst of the Depression, had fought to keep the fishing fleet viable, had battled bureaucrats in Edinburgh and London who seemed to think that small Scottish towns were expendable. He had earned the respect of his people not through political maneuvering or clever speeches, but through the simple act of keeping his word, of standing up for his community, of never backing down from a fight he believed was worth fighting. But the fight that was coming would test him in ways he had never imagined. The morning of September 1st, 1939, began like any other. MacLeod rose at 5 a.m., as he had every morning for 20 years. He walked to the harbour, as he had every morning since becoming provost. He checked on the boats, spoke with the fishermen, and watched the sun rise over the Sound of Mull. But something was different that morning. The fishermen were gathered around old Callan McInnes, who had been listening to his shortwave radio. The news was crackling through the static. German forces had crossed into Poland. The invasion had begun. MacLeod stood there in the growing daylight, watching the faces of the men he had known all his life. These were not men given to panic or hysteria. These were men who had faced storms that could sink ships, who had pulled drowning sailors from icy waters, and who had buried their sons and brothers and fathers in foreign fields. But now, for the first time in his memory, he saw fear in their eyes. "What do we do now, Provost?" asked young Jeanie Stewart, his voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. "What do we do?" MacLeod looked out across the harbour, across the Sound of Mull, toward the mainland where politicians and generals were no doubt meeting in emergency session. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of Culloden and the clearances, of all the times when Scotland had been forced to wait for England to decide its fate. He thought of the newsreels from Germany, of the faces of their refugees, and of the children who would wake up homeless in Poland that very morning. "We don't wait," he said quietly. "We don't wait for London to tell us what to think. We don't wait for Edinburgh to give us permission to act. We decide for ourselves what's right, and then we do it." By 8 a.m., MacLeod was walking up the hill to the town hall, his mind made up. By 9 a.m., he was on the telephone to the other members of the town council, calling an emergency meeting. By 10 a.m., word had spread through Tobermory like wildfire. The provost was calling the council together to discuss the war. The Tobermory Town Council consisted of 5 men besides MacLeod himself. There was Angus Morrison, the retired schoolmaster who had taught half the town to read. There was Robert Campbell, who ran the general store and knew every family's troubles and triumphs. There was Duncan McNeill, the harbor master who had guided ships safely through treacherous waters for 30 years. There was Dr. William Fraser, the town's only physician, who had delivered most of the children and buried most of the elders. And there was James McPherson, the banker, who had somehow managed to keep the town's finances stable through the worst years of the Depression. These were not men of great wealth or formal education. They were not politicians or diplomats or military strategists. They were simply men who had been chosen by their neighbors to make decisions about street repairs and market licenses and the annual Highland Games. They were about to make a decision that would echo through the corridors of power around the world. The meeting was called for 11 a.m. By 10:30, a crowd had gathered outside the town hall. Word had spread not just through Tobermory, but to the surrounding villages, the outlying farms, and the fishing communities scattered across the island. People came by foot, by bicycle, and by cart. They came because they knew that something momentous was about to happen, something that would define who they were and what they stood for. At exactly 11 a.m., Provost MacLeod called the meeting to order. The 6 men sat around a table that had been built in 1847, the year of the Great Famine, when their ancestors had learned that survival sometimes required desperate measures. Outside, the crowd pressed against the windows, straining to hear every word. "Gentlemen," MacLeod began, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Scottish leadership, "we are gathered here because our world has changed. This morning, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. We all know what this means. We all know what's coming. The question before us is simple. What do we do?" Angus Morrison, the schoolmaster, spoke first. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he held his notes. "Provost, we all know what's right. We all know what should be done, but we also know what's legal, what's proper, and what's expected of us. We're a town council, not a government. We fix potholes and organize festivals. We don't declare war." Robert Campbell, the shopkeeper, nodded in agreement. "Angus is right. We could send a telegram to London expressing our support for whatever decision the government makes. We could organize a fund for Polish refugees. We could do many things within our authority, but declaring war, that's not for us to decide." MacLeod listened to each man in turn. Duncan McNeill worried about the legal implications. Dr. Fraser spoke of the practical consequences. James McPherson calculated the financial costs. Each man raised valid concerns, reasonable objections, and sensible alternatives. And then MacLeod stood up. Outside, the crowd fell silent. Inside, the 5 councilmen looked at their leader with a mixture of respect, fear, and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he said, "I hear what you're saying. I understand your concerns, but I want you to think about something. I want you to think about the children of Poland who are dying while we debate procedure. I want you to think about the families who are fleeing while we worry about legalities. I want you to think about the evil that is spreading across Europe while we wait for someone else to give us permission to oppose it." He walked to the window, looking out at the faces of his people. "My grandfather fought at Culloden," He told me stories of that day, of how the Highland clans stood against the English army knowing they were outnumbered, knowing they would probably die, but standing anyway because it was right. My father was driven from his land during the clearances. He could have fought back, could have resisted, but he didn't. He waited for the law to protect him, waited for the government to help him, and waited for someone else to do what was right. And while he waited, they burned his home and scattered his family. MacLeod turned back to the council. Gentlemen, we have a choice. We can wait for London to act, wait for Westminster to debate, and wait for politicians to make speeches while evil spreads across the world. Or we can do what our ancestors should have done. We can stand up, we can act, we can lead. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm not asking you to rebel against the crown. I'm asking you to do what every free people has the right to do, decide for themselves what's right and what's wrong. Poland is being invaded. Democracy is under attack. Freedom is being destroyed. We can choose to oppose it, or we can choose to wait for someone else to oppose it for us. The debate that followed would be remembered by every man in that room for the rest of his life. It lasted for 3 hours. They discussed law and precedent, morality and practicality, and courage and consequences. They talked about their families, their community, and their responsibility to both the present and the future. Angus Morrison spoke of the children he had taught, the young men who had gone to war in 1914 and never returned. If we do this, he said, if we take this step, we're not just making a statement. We're making a commitment. We're saying that we're willing to back up our words with action. Are we prepared for that? Robert Campbell talked about the practical implications. If we declare war, what does that mean? Do we expect the people of Tobermory to fight? Do we expect them to make sacrifices? Do we have the right to make that decision? Duncan McNeill, the harbor master, had spent his life reading the weather, predicting storms, and knowing when to seek shelter and when to brave the elements. I've seen storms that would sink any ship, he said, but I've also seen storms that you have to sail through because the alternative is worse. Sometimes the dangerous thing is also the right thing. Dr. Fraser spoke as a man who had seen death, who had held the hands of dying soldiers, and who had comforted families torn apart by war. We're talking about war, he said quietly. We're talking about sending our young men to die in foreign countries. We're talking about bringing death and destruction into our peaceful world. Are we certain that's what we want? And then James McPherson, the banker, the most practical and cautious of them all, said something that surprised everyone. I've been thinking about my ledger books, he said. I've been thinking about all the accounts I keep, all the debts and credits, all the careful calculations. But there are some things that can't be measured in pounds and shillings. There are some debts that can't be paid with money if we don't act now. If we wait for others to act for us, what will we tell our children? What will we tell ourselves? The clock on the town hall tower chimed to p.m. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. People had come from across the island, drawn by rumors and whispers and the sense that history was being made in their little town. Provost MacLeod called for order. Gentlemen, we've heard all the arguments. We've considered all the implications. Now we must decide. I propose that the Tobermory Town Council, acting on behalf of the people of Scotland, declare that a state of war exists between Scotland and Nazi Germany. The motion hung in the air like smoke from a cannon. Outside, a seagull cried. Inside, 6 men sat around a table that had witnessed a century of local decisions, about to make a decision that would echo around the world, all in favor, one by one, slowly, deliberately. Each man raised his hand, first Morrison, then Campbell, then McNeill, then Fraser, then McPherson, finally MacLeod himself. The motion is carried unanimously. At 3:17 p.m. on September 1, 1939, the The Tobermory Town Council became the first government in the British Empire to declare war on Nazi Germany. They had beaten London by 2 days, Edinburgh by 3, and the rest of the empire by a week. But their work was far from over. The easy part was the decision. The hard part was what came next. MacLeod stood up from the table, his face pale but determined. "Gentlemen, we've made our choice. Now we must act on it. Duncan, I want you to contact the harbor master, Noban. Tell him that Tobermory is officially at war and that we're prepared to assist with any military operations. Robert, I want you to organize a committee to collect supplies for Polish refugees. Dr. Fraser, I want you to prepare for casualties. We don't know what form this war will take, but we must be ready. Angus, I want you to draft a proclamation to be posted throughout the town. The people have a right to know what we've decided in their name. James, I want you to calculate how much we can afford to spend on war materials. And I want all of you to go home and tell your families what we've done, because by tomorrow morning, the whole world will know." MacLeod walked to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, the script of a man who had learned to write by copying the Bible and the works of Robert Burns. "But first," he said, "we must inform the relevant authorities of our decision." What he wrote next would send shockwaves through the British government, would reach the desk of Adolf Hitler himself, and would change the course of World War II. But the telegram that would make history was still unwritten, and the reaction it would provoke was beyond anything these 6 Scottish council men could have imagined. The Tobermory post office was a small stone building that had served the community for over a century. Its walls had witnessed the sending of countless messages, birth announcements, death notices, love letters, and business correspondence. But never had it been asked to transmit a declaration of war. At 3:30 p.m., just 13 minutes after the council vote, Provost MacLeod walked through the green-painted door carrying a folded piece of paper that would either make him a hero, a traitor to the crown. Margaret Campbell, the postmistress, looked up from her ledger with the practiced smile of a woman who had seen every drama the human heart could produce. "Afternoon, Provost," she said in the lilting accent of the Western Isles. "I heard there was some excitement at the council meeting. The whole town's talking about it." MacLeod placed the paper on the counter. His hands, which had guided fishing nets through storms and had never trembled in the face of danger, were shaking slightly. "Margaret, I need to send 3 telegrams. Urgent, priority." Margaret Campbell had been postmistress for 18 years. She had sent telegrams to London, Tottenburg, and to every corner of the empire. She had transmitted messages of joy and sorrow, of business and pleasure, and of love and loss. But as she read the addresses on MacLeod's paper, her eyes widened with shock. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, 10 Downing Street, London. Chancellor Adolf Hitler, Reich Chancellery, Berlin. First Minister of Scotland, Edinburgh. She looked up at MacLeod, her face pale. "Provost, are you certain about this?" MacLeod met her gaze steadily. "Margaret, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The message is the same for all 3. Can you transmit it?" With trembling fingers, Margaret Campbell read the message that would change the world. Tobermory Town Council hereby declares a state of war exists between Scotland and Nazi Germany. Effective immediately. Stop actions against Polish sovereignty. Constitute acts of aggression. Stop. Scotland will not stand idle. Stop. Provost Donald MacLeod, Tobermory, Isle of Mull, Scotland. For a moment, the only sound in the post office was the ticking of the grandfather clock that had marked time for 3 generations of Campbell postmistresses. Margaret stared at the message, reading it again and again, as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough. "Provost," she said finally, "do you understand what this means? You're declaring war on Germany. You're speaking for all of Scotland. You are—" She paused, searching for words. "You're making history." MacLeod nodded slowly. "I am, Margaret. I know what it means. My grandfather told me that a man's worth is measured not by the comfort of his life, but by the courage of his choices. Today, we choose courage. Margaret Campbell had sworn an oath when she became postmistress to transmit all messages faithfully and without censorship. She had sent news of deaths and births, of business deals and broken hearts, of victories and defeats, but never had she sent a message that could start a war or end one. "It will take about 20 minutes to reach London," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Berlin will take longer, maybe an hour. Edinburgh should receive it within the quarter hour." As the message tapped out across the wires, MacLeod stood at the window of the post office, watching the harbor where the fishing boats were returning from their daily catch. The men on those boats had no idea that their provost had just declared war on the most powerful military machine in the world. They were thinking about their nets and their catch, about their families and their suppers, and about the small concerns of daily life that suddenly seemed both precious and fragile. The first telegram reached Edinburgh at 3:47 p.m. The duty officer at the Scottish office read it twice, then rushed it to his superior. Within minutes, it was on the desk of the First Minister, who stared at it in disbelief before reaching for his telephone. "Get me the Prime Minister's office," he barked. "Emergency. Tell them Scotland has declared war on Germany." The second telegram reached London at 4:02 p.m. It was delivered to 10 Downing Street by a breathless messenger who had cycled through the London traffic with the urgency of a man carrying news of Armagh. Eden, the Prime Minister's private secretary, Sir Horace Wilson, read it once, blinked, and read it again. Wilson burst into the cabinet room, where Chamberlain was meeting with his senior ministers about the Polish situation. The room fell silent as Wilson handed the telegram to the Prime Minister. Chamberlain adjusted his spectacles and read the message aloud. "Tobermory Town Council hereby declares a state of war exists between Scotland and Nazi Germany. Effective immediately." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax dropped his pen. Chancellor of the Exchequer Sir John Simon spilled his tea. War Secretary Leslie Hoare Belisha leaped to his feet. "Scotland has done what? A town council. Is this legal? Who gave them authority? What does this mean for the Empire?" "Mean for," Hess said, handing over the telegram. "We have received a declaration of war from Scotland." Hitler read the message, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of manic amusement. He began to laugh, not the hearty laughter of genuine humor, but the harsh, grating laughter of a man who had just been presented with an absurdity too ridiculous to be believed. "Scotland," he said, his voice rising. "A fishing village dares to declare war on the Third Reich. Where is Scotland exactly? How many divisions do they have? What is their air force, their navy?" Goebbels, always quick to sense his master's mood, joined in the laughter. "Mean for, perhaps we should be terrified. Perhaps the Highland warriors will march on Berlin with their bagpipes and their sheep. But—" Hitler's laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun. His face darkened, and his eyes narrowed. "Find out everything about this Provost MacLeod. Find out about this town. Find out how many people support this declaration. And find out why the British government has not acted." Within hours, German intelligence was mobilizing to gather information about Tobermory. Maps were consulted, population figures were calculated, and strategic assessments were made. The Third Reich's war machine, designed to crush nations, was suddenly focused on a Scottish town with fewer than 1,000 inhabitants. Back in London, the government was in chaos. Emergency meetings were called, legal experts were consulted, the constitutional implications were debated. Could a local council declare war? Did they speak for Scotland? What about the other dominions? If Scotland could act independently, what about Canada, Australia, and South Africa? At 6:30 p.m., Chamberlain called an emergency session of the cabinet. The agenda was simple but earth-shaking. What to do about Scotland's declaration of war? Gentlemen, Chamberlain began, his voice tight with stress, we face an unprecedented situation. A local council in Scotland has declared war on Germany. The legal department tells me that, technically, they may have the authority to do this under ancient Scottish law. The Foreign Office tells me that Berlin is taking this seriously, and the press is beginning to ask questions. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, spoke first. Prime Minister, this is intolerable. We cannot have local councils making foreign policy. We cannot have Scotland acting independently of the Empire. We must repudiate this declaration immediately. But Sir John Simon, the Chancellor, disagreed. Halifax, we can't simply ignore this. If we repudiate the declaration, we're essentially saying that Scotland was wrong to oppose Nazi Germany. How will that look to the public? How will that look to our allies? The debate raged for hours. Some ministers wanted to arrest MacLeod for treason. Others wanted to support the declaration. Still others wanted to find a middle path that would somehow satisfy everyone and offend no one. At 8:15 p.m., the debate was interrupted by an urgent call from the BBC. The news had leaked. Reporters were demanding comment. The story was about to break across the empire. Prime Minister, the BBC director said, we have confirmation that a Scottish town has declared war on Germany. The story is already being picked up by American news services. We need a government response. Within the bar, Chamberlain felt the walls closing in. The decision he had been avoiding for days was now being forced upon him by a Scottish fishing village. He could either support MacLeod's declaration, effectively endorsing Scotland's right to act independently, or he could repudiate it, effectively saying that Britain was not ready to oppose Nazi Germany. At 9:30 p.m., Chamberlain made his decision. He would send a telegram to Tobermory acknowledging their declaration but asserting Westminster's authority over foreign policy. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing. The telegram to MacLeod was brief. Acknowledge receipt. Your declaration. Stop matter under urgent review. Stop advise immediate consultation. Stop Prime Minister Chamberlain.